Okay, so I am basically a storyteller, and that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to tell you about 3 stories which will try to illustrate this idea that has been reported from time to time over the last 7-8 years, gross national happiness, and how it connects to the themes which Mohinder has beautifully introduced. So I'll start with a story about a guy called Charlie. This story came to me in the early days of email, and it was written by somebody who found Charlie very annoying because Charlie was forever happy. No matter what day of the week, no matter what time of the day you met Charlie, he was balle balle. So finally this guy, the writer of the story, said, one day got hold of him and said, yaar, aise ho nahi sakta. You know, you are a faker. Nobody can be so happy all the time. So come on, tell me what is the truth of your life. वो गाना है ना, तुम बड़ा मुस्कुरा रहे हो, कौन सा गम है छुपा रहे हो. Charlie said, no yaar, really honestly I have no gum. I just get up every morning and tell myself, Charlie, you have 2 choices. Today you can be either grumpy or you can be cheerful. And every morning I make a choice to be cheerful. So this guy said, yeah, it's a PR line, I don't buy it. Anyway, one day he hears that Charlie has been shot, he's in an ICU. Turns out Charlie is, by the way, a restaurant owner. So one night when Charlie was locking up his restaurant, some people came in to collect his day's earnings. Charlie tried to talk them out of it, so they shot him. So our friend, the writer, shows up in the hospital, you know, when he's allowed to meet patients, and says, yaar, kya hua? So Charlie says, yaar, I mean, you know, this is what happened, these guys came, and the next thing I know, I woke up, I was on a table, and all these hospital lights were shining in my face, and the doctors, the nurses, everybody, you know, their faces were really scary because I took one look at their eyes and I knew all of them are looking at me and thinking, dead guy. And at that moment, he says, this nurse asked me, okay, Mr. Charlie, are you allergic to anything? So Charlie said, yeah. So they all stopped whatever they were doing and waited till he told them. So Charlie says, I'm allergic to bullets, guys. And as they were chuckling, he said, look, I have every intention of living. Don't you dare treat me like a dead guy. And now you operate on me, thinking of me as a guy who's going to live to be 100. And so, you know, as they are chuckling, they give him the anesthesia, and as you can see, Charlie has survived because he's having this conversation with his friend. So, आज इस बंदे ने genuinely फिर चार्ली से कहा कि यार अब बता दे क्या secret है. Charlie said, "Like it's very simple. It is your attitude, not your aptitude, that determines your altitude. It is your attitude, not your aptitude, that determines your altitude." And I would just like to take this simple theme and illustrate 2-3 things that I think, well, I hope are shaping our world. So the first one is about this term gross national happiness and how it illustrates this. Let's think of it as a dance between attitude and aptitude. So this term was coined by a young man when he was 18. He happened to be the prince of the Himalayan kingdom of Bhutan. And the first tarred road was laid while this man he was a young boy. He was still a child. That's when this country got its first tarred road in the late 60s, 1960s. The first bank was created in Bhutan in 1969 or 70, the first modern bank. Okay, so that's what, I'm just giving you 2 parameters of what they had in terms of aptitude. And now I'm going to use the word aptitude and resources stroke development as being the same. And by a quirk of fate, when this young prince, handsome young prince, by the way, I must tell you, he's very handsome also. When he was just 18, his father died and he found himself king. Now, if you looked at what he had in his country by way of aptitude, that is resources, as I said, barely one road, no airport, a lot of people living at bare subsistence level, meaning just about roti, kapda, or makan, nothing more. This young man in 1972 declares to his ministers that in my kingdom we will work not to attain a higher GDP, gross domestic product, but to build gross national happiness. By this he meant that we will only do that in terms of resources. We will only build our aptitude as much as it matches this attitude. That what we really seek is well-being and happiness. Not for their sake roads, or not just for its own sake more power, or just for its own sake more hotels or more tourists to give us more money. And for almost 30 years, this country did this very quietly. They didn't make a noise about it in the world. Now, we are not here today to discuss to what extent they succeeded or not. What matters at the moment for our purposes today is that term which this then young, he is now in his late 50s, and as you might have heard, he has recently actually retired and handed over to his young son. So he is now the erstwhile king. He has become an inspiration for people across the world, because what he said in 1972, by the late 80s, 1989, the president of the World Bank was acknowledging. Barbara Conable said in 1989 that yes, there is a problem. Ever since the Second World War, we have been measuring progress according to gross domestic GDP, but we are finding that it doesn't work. Because many countries' GDP is rising, but their happiness levels are falling. Not only in our sense, okay, that part we know, okay, in India there is a disparity. GDP is rising for you and me, while 80 to 70% of our people are still not able to join this party. That's one story. But the bigger story is that in the US and in many parts of the so-called developed world, where say 90% of the population has become well off, but happiness levels are stagnant. In some cases they are falling. So quite independent of the Bhutan story, in America, in the 90s, some scholars and activists and freedom seekers defined a new concept. They call it genuine progress indicators. The last story is about a lady who is a big inspiration for me. Her name is Amy Dominy. She started out as a Xerox copier, a clerk in a stockbroker's firm in Boston, in the early 70s. When she was just out of college, and she was, so as you can imagine, that means she was in high school and college through the hippie movement and the flower power movement of the late 60s, anti-Vietnam War, all of that. But like most people, when she left college, she wanted to be a stockbroker, she became a stockbroker, and she left all that behind her, all that you do in your youth. Worry about fees in some other corner of the world and all that. Now I'm going to be a professional, I'm going to make money. And so Amy proceeded to do that and was quite happy for a while doing it. But then gradually, something was niggling at the back of her mind. And she says that for years I managed to ignore that itch at the back of my neck because, hey, the money was so good. But something kept coming back to her in a very small, like a faint signal from a very distant planet. That there were some clients who would call her and say, Amy, don't buy me stock in such and such company because I've read a report that they are destroying rainforests. Another client would say, I want to pull out of company ABC because I'm told that they are very active in South Africa and I don't want to make money out of anything in South Africa because I oppose apartheid. And for her, the flip moment came one day when she had a tip on a big defense contract for a company, an arms manufacturer, which she was about to start making the calls. In those days everything was phone calls. This is all pre-email, pre-internet days. She was actually about to call some of her high net worth clients and say, look, buy that stock today because when the news breaks, this stock is going to skyrocket. And suddenly, she couldn't do it. She picked up the phone, but she couldn't dial the number because she said to herself, it's suddenly like, all that distant signal became very loud. Because she said, what am I doing? I am actually calling people, inviting them to buy a stock in a company that is going to make profits by creating or encouraging war in some corner of the world so that it can sell its armaments. And it bothered her enough, it was interfering with her personal happiness in a way that then also echoed with those calls she was getting from those random clients who were disturbed by apartheid or disturbed by reports of child labor in a brand, a company whose brand they otherwise used. And so Amy stopped and took action. It's an example of an innovator with discipline and energy. And over the next 20 years, she came to be known as the founding mom of socially responsible investing. In 2000, when Barron's magazine did a list of 30 people who changed the face of finance in America, Amy was the only woman on that list. And the reason why this story is to be so inspiring is because she did it not by raving and ranting or, crying about it. She did something about it. And she did it at a time when people told her it can't be done. Amy in the 1975, 1976, and she was a woman. In any case, she was at a disadvantage. Because she was trying to build a career in a man's world, and then she was doing exactly what they had said women will do. They will introduce Rona Dhona into this nice, tough, muscular business. And she was nevertheless speaking her truth in defiance. And the rest is history. Today, socially responsible investing is estimated to involve some $3 trillion by a conservative estimate. That is, $3 trillion are under management today by being run through some kind of non-monetary filter. That is, those investments are managed to deliver on 3 bottom lines. The money one, yes, of course. It's illegal for you to manage somebody's money and actively work to lose it, right? So definitely, they do deliver financial returns, but not only financial returns. They also deliver by working for some form of social benefit, some visible social benefit, or at least no social harm. So at the very least, they don't harm somebody, but the higher, those who seek to be rated higher on the SRI totem pole, actually do something actively that is socially beneficial, over and above employing people. That's not considered an extra social benefit. An environment. And the reason why this is so important for us is because, as you saw in the 2 presentations, both by Sumit and by Bhupinder, I think we are all faced in India with a very big choice also, like that, not just in our personal lives, that's easy for us to do, to learn from that man Charlie, that our attitude can change our altitude, can determine actually our altitude. But I think we have this same choice to make as a country. And for better or for worse, a lot of the fate of this country is in the hands of people like you and me. And I think it's going to be determined by whether we can define our freedom, and I mean both financial freedom and our attitudinal freedom, in ways that is not just about us, the individual us, but about some sense of a larger family. And I know that sounds vague, but now my time is up, so maybe you'll ask me a question and I can explain myself. Thank you.